Okay, well, almost ready to start. All right, so welcome to the CRML event, Unraveling the Secrets of ChatGPT, a panel for scholars and educators. And it is my great honor to host this event at Center for Responsible Machine Learning, but we cannot do this event without the support from the campus. So today's event is co-sponsored by the Center for Responsible Machine Learning, the Mellon Champion Initiative on Mind and Machine Intelligence, the Office of Teaching and Learning, Office of Research, Center for Innovative Teaching, Research and Learning, Instructional Development, UCSB Library, Center for Information Technology and Society. And special thanks to Chancellor Henry Young, Executive Vice Chancellor David Marshall, Office of Public Affairs and Communications, Professor Ambrose Singh in Computer Science Department, of course, the support from the Computer Science Department to make this happen. So for today's event, this is the agenda. Then I will ask David to give us an introduction. Then I will try to tell you some backgrounds about ChatGPT. So hopefully we're aligned in terms of the background technology for ChatGPT. Then we'll have a very interesting panel discussion with our distinguished panelists on ChatGPT and its impact on research, teaching, learning, and also our society. And with all that, I would like to welcome UCSB Executive Vice Chancellor David Marshall to give us welcome remarks.
Thank you, William. And thank you for organizing such an important event. I know it's one of many that we're having on campus. And seeing that list of co-sponsors and seeing all of the panelists that we have today really makes me feel that UCSB is in a sort of perfect situation to be able to bring to bear so many disciplines and so many collaborative approaches to really address these important issues. So I'm just going to make some brief remarks by way of welcome. So I'm a scholar of literary studies, like my colleague Rita Raley. So I always pay attention to the metaphors that people use in talking about these types of issues, particularly ChatGPT and OpenAI and artificial intelligence. And one of the things I've noticed is that people are continually talking about an arms race, and this is the metaphor that they use to describe it. And if you just even, Google that, or I guess ask ChatGPT, you'll see, like, in February alone, there were just numerous articles and headlines how ChatGPT kicked off an AI arms race. The AI arms race is changing everything. And Ezra Klein, the New York Times columnist and podcaster, has really given a lot of very interesting attention to these things. And he's talked about the race for AI dominance, whether it's between industry, among industries or US and China or whatever. Ezra Klein has also given some of the most apocalyptic scenarios about what could go wrong and warnings about the kind of lack of interest in what can go wrong among those who are developing this in this arms race. Google, Microsoft, and Meta racing to compete with each other, but without a concern for the unintended consequences. So on college campuses, I think we're also caught up in this metaphor, and it reminds me of the efforts to develop plagiarism detection software in response to that moment when there were online term paper factories that we were all worried about. We saw during the pandemic when we had online exams, ProctorU and other efforts to try to respond to the new problems that suddenly developed there. And now I think we feel ourselves to be in a race to develop tools to protect our pedagogical and assessment practices from escalating weapons that would seem to undermine academic integrity and pedagogical traditions. And I want to emphasize the importance of an academic response to these issues, not just on our campus, but in general, because only we can bring together computer scientists and literary scholars and communication scholars and curricular and pedagogical design experts who really can think about the need to bring to bear technology, ethics, and a knowledge of the history of other revolutionary moments in mass media and mass communication that might inform the current situation. More locally, I think, as we look at a need to reassess our pedagogy and our interaction with students, one response might be to go back thousands of years and return to the tradition of the Socratic dialogue that took place in the agora of ancient Athens. But of course, that's very difficult to scale in a large public university. And I would remind you that Plato, in his Phaedrus, expressed a great distrust and skepticism and fear of that new technology of writing. So how do we respond to this moment? We need to understand it, but ideally I think we would respond with creativity, with pedagogical innovation, rather than fear and a despondent sense that we're destined to lose the classroom arms race here. So we need to renew our efforts to teach our students about academic integrity, ethics, critical thinking, creativity, and the importance of understanding technology in both social and human contexts. So I have confidence that people in this room and on campus are equipped to do that, and I look forward to hearing about the discussions that emerge from all of these discussions. So thank you again for organizing this, and I'm sure that it will be one of many in the year ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you. All right, so let's just move on to the first part that it is my great pleasure to tell you a little bit about my understanding about ChatGPT. As someone who working in NLP for the last 15 years, it's super exciting to see the growth of technology, but what exactly is behind the technology, right? Hopefully in the next 20 minutes, I can give you a glimpse, right, into some of the things I know that might be of interest to you. Okay, so the unbelievable strengths of pre-trained language models is that it's not just about the language itself, right? There are a lot of different use cases I think people are still exploring for ChatGPT every day. One thing that many of the computer science students actually explored, is understanding, program, right? Because ChatGPT, you can actually use it to generate program. And here I'm showing you an example of how ChatGPT can actually help security researchers to understand these buffer overflow issues, right, in a CTF challenge. And a big shout out to our colleague Giovanni Vigna, who is getting this $20 million AI Institute to UCSB. That's really important work. How do we actually understand, right, security through the lenses of the interaction between natural language processing, program synthesis, and also understand that interaction. So fundamentally, you can see ChatGPT is also changing NLP, and also not just NLP, but also how we are teaching program, right? How people are actually writing program. But of course, as someone who has been teaching machine learning on this campus for many years, I found it's getting harder and harder to teach because teaching is one thing, right? But how do you engage student, right? How do you entertain student? I think that's really important that we all agree. And then I asked, can I ask ChatGPT to write me a joke? Because this quarter I'm teaching at the new ILP classroom building. So I'm super excited and privileged to teach in this building. So then I asked ChatGPT to write me a joke about ChatGPT, GPT-3, and GPT-4 walking to this building. So ChatGPT said, ChatGPT, GPT-3, and GPT-4 walk into the new ILP building at UCSB. A professor sees them and asks, are you here to enroll in my advanced computational linguistics course? That's probably me. And then ChatGPT says, no, we're here to teach it. And then GPT-3 adds, well, technically, we're here to predict what will be taught. And then GPT-4 said, well, given our training, we'd like to assign in homework too. Right, so you can see that this is pretty incredible, like already making better jokes than what I can make. This is just two use cases, right? Analyzing program, writing a joke, but you see there's just two tasks, right, among many of the tasks that ChatGPT can do. But to really give you a big picture, I think we need to backtrack a little bit because ChatGPT is a product, okay? So it is based on something called language model. So this is sort of the big picture of what the language model family looks like. There is the fundamental technology of language modeling that has been there for more than 20 years. And then there's, of course, neural language model that happens more recently in the last 15 years. But then there's also, this development of large language models, right? GPT-3 model, and there's new version with GPT-4 with images. What is the difference between GPT-3 and ChatGPT? Well, GPT-3 is a large language model, right? Itself is not a conversational, right, system. But then if you use instruction tuning, human feedback, I'll tell you a little bit more, then you can actually develop ChatGPT from this GPT-3 models, right? But then I'll also tell you a little bit more how do you actually build on top of ChatGPT to actually integrate information retrieval so that you can retrieve documents and generate output from that document. But of course, on the other hand, David said, there's also an arm race between different industry companies, and Google on the other side, they also have their own system. If we have time, we'll also briefly talk about a little bit about their attempts. Okay, so fundamentally, I think even to machine learning researcher and AI researcher, there's a big change in the last year or so in terms of the paradigms of the things, how it works. Specifically, when we think about machine learning, when we teach machine learning, a long time ago, we think about this scenario. You collect some training data, right? Whether it's spam versus ham classification, email filtering. Well, you collect some training data, right? And then you train a model, and then you test it, right? So this is a classic machine learning paradigm that has been working wonderfully until 2018. And in 2018, what happens is that Google, based on their own transformer architecture from 2017, they created this model called BERT that actually trained on massive amount of English data, for example, all of Wikipedia. So you can think about Google's approach of BERT is basically taking this massive English language corpus and training a system that understands the basic concepts and grammars and semantics in English. So what that means is that if you have any specific task that you're interested, whether it's sentiment classification or spam filtering, you don't have to collect a massive amount of training data anymore. You only need to collect a small amount of in-domain data, right? For example, 10,000 reviews to do sentiment analysis, and you only collect a small percent of data, and then what you do is that you fine-tune, right, this pre-trained large language model that was already pre-trained on large English corpus. So if you do that, turned out you can significantly improve the empirical result for a lot of different tasks, right, that you care about. But what happens is that didn't last very long. That only lasts about 4 years. And since last year, people realized that you can further scale up, right, this large language model to even 175 billion parameters, for example, from OpenAI GPT-3 model. And when you scale up to this particular size, there's a very interesting emergent ability that show up, right, in this model is what we call in-context learning or instruction learning. So you no longer have to train or fine-tune this model anymore. What you do is that in the testing time or in the inference time, you basically write your task, right? For example, the task here is to do machine translation. So I would write translate English to French, and I give 3 examples, right? This is what I mean by in-context examples. So I give 3 demonstrations of English and French translation pairs, and then I ask the system to generate a translation for the English word cheese, okay? And it will give me a good answer. So this is the new paradigm that is based on instruction learning. It's based on in-context learning. If you have a few examples, this is also called fuchsia learning. ChatGPT is a specific version of this that at least from what you can see in the interface, you don't use any in-context examples. So it's more aligned to zero-shot learning cases, okay? But, okay, now here's the thing. I want you to understand the training of large language models in the next maybe a few minutes, and also the data. But let's first do the training. And to do training, I really need your help to work with me on this Shannon game, okay? And what we're gonna do is that I'm gonna read a part of the sentence, and you're gonna help me to complete that sentence by predict the next word. So let's do this and see how well we can do, okay? The cat sits on the mat. Lap. Okay, so a lot of different answers. That's good because we don't know where the cat might sit. That's good. Okay, the next one. I would like to order a pizza with pepperoni and pineapple. Okay. Okay, that's very interesting. And then how about the next one? UCSB is situated on cliffs directly above the Pacific. You see the last one, right? So you did it really well, right? There's some perplexity with each one, but with few examples with training, now you're a good language model too. But that's that. Well, if I just need to use one formula in this particular presentation, that will be this formula, exactly what we did just now. That's actually how people are training this language model. You are basically trying to estimate which sentence is more likely, but the task itself is very difficult. So instead of doing that directly, you're trying to basically predict, right, the likelihood of this next word based on the words you've seen before. So that is the only formula you will see in today's talk. That's exactly what we did. And that's how OpenAI and all these different systems, right, that were trained in the pre-training stage. So very simple, okay? But you can see as a large language model, what it will give you is this probabilistic distribution, right? So you ask a query, it's actually trying to generate a completion as the next word. So this is basically pre-training. What's interesting about this paradigm is that some people call it self-supervised pre-training, in the sense that we don't do any annotation, right? In the past, when we do machine learning, especially supervised learning, you have to have a linguist or a lot of researchers to provide us labels, right, to do this annotation for your task. But with this particular approach, you don't have to do any annotation. You can take any news articles, right? You can take any corpus, but then you just remove the next word, you predict the next word, you have the ground truth, right? You can always, right, tune your parameter to minimize this particular loss to be able to align, right, with the correct prediction. So basically training this transformer architecture, training a neural network to be able to predict, right, correctly with this answer. So architecture-wise, I would say GPT-2 and 3, they use exactly the same pre-training objective. So there's really not much difference, right, in terms of the scale, but maybe something wrong, something is different with the data. I'll tell you a little bit later. Okay. Then what's the difference between these fundamental large language models and ChatGPT? There is something that's very unique to ChatGPT. Not only is a product, it is also a conversational agent, right? How do you turn these large language models into ChatGPT? Well, there is a thing called instruction tuning and reinforcement learning with human feedback. So what happens is that you can basically write these prompts, and then you can generate results, but then you would have human, right, to give you some annotation to tell you whether this is a good or this is a bad response. So with that human feedback, then OpenAI trained this system to be able to learn a reward model that tells you, okay, this is likely to be a good generation, this is likely to be a bad generation. By doing this, you can see they're actually trying to align the generation result with human preference, right? So it's not just training the next word anymore, but then you actually fine-tune the model to align with human preference because you're asking the labeler, right, to look at some desired output behavior. With all that information, now you can actually use reinforcement learning or other techniques to update the parameters of the model so that it is more aligned, right, to the human preference. So that's the difference of going from just pre-training large language model to ChatGPT, that you do want to fine-tune it, align it with the human preference for the conversational data. But I think what's really amazing about this large language model is what we call this emerging ability of language model. And what happens on the right-hand side is that you can see sometimes when you're just trying to scale up, right, you don't see the jump in predictive accuracy. But only you reach a certain point, right, with regard to the parameter size, that suddenly you're getting amazing performance, right, on all of these different tasks. And many of the tasks are new, right? They're not old tasks. For example, the first task is called modified arithmetic, and what it does is that it's not asking ChatGPT to learn, addition. It's creating a new operator called add one more, right? It's basically you're now defining 200 plus 1 is not 201, but it's actually 202, right? So that's the task. So how can the large language model learn this new task? It's not easy, okay? But turned out that when you increase the size of the pre-trained language model, then suddenly this emergent behavior, they show up. And as you can see, this also do not really come from the pre-training objective, right? Because the pre-training objective, you're just predicting the next word. So how come you're predicting the next word? Then suddenly you're getting this emergent behavior. That also, I think, is an interesting research problem. At UCSB, we're trying to understand in-context learning behavior. So one of our students, Xinyi, wrote a paper recently trying to understand and explain this in-context learning behavior by looking at Bayesian perspective to sort of trying to infer, right? Whether we can understand the latent concept associated with the task and then continuation based on the task. I can tell you more about that later. Okay, so hopefully now everybody is clear with the training algorithm for large language models. Now I'm going to use the next few slides, very important, to tell you the training data, okay? I think many of you may not have read this very important Washington Post article, but this is the article that is very critical because it actually tells you the training data of ChatGPT. ChatGPT itself is closed technology, but we can guess from the Google C4 corpus what kind of data, right, actually OpenAI use to train such a system. So what makes them sound very smart? Well, turned out that this is the distribution of the C4 training corpus. Very likely that this reflects the training data for ChatGPT as well. And C4 stands for Colossal Clean Crowd Corpus. As you can see, this has a really nice distribution, right, of topics, business and industry, technology, news and media. And on the right-hand side, you can actually see, right, the list of websites they actually crawled, right, in terms of the data. For example, there are pattern data from Google. There's definitely Wikipedia, New York Times, actually Science and Health journals, PLOS. There's also a lot of news articles and different sources. So you can see this. I actually also tried to ask this question, is there any UCSB data that was included in the training? So turned out there are. They actually crawled UCSB data. So UCSB actually contribute to 78,000 of tokens in Google C4 data. That is very likely to end up in many of the large language models you use. So if you have anything on UCSB websites, probably they have seen you as well in their data. Okay, but that is just the C4 corpus, right? Our hypothesis is that people have been using much bigger corpus than just C4. So you can see that the C4 corpus is close to like 175 billion, 190 billion tokens or words, right? But in reality, these companies, they use more diverse set of training data. For example, GitHub archive all of the scientific articles, books, a lot of the books, regardless of their copyright status. And then there's, Wikipedia, Stack Exchange, and all that, right? So you can see Red Pajama is an open source version that is trying to replicate some of the training data mix from this large language model. So you can see this is a distribution. They ended up with 1.2 trillion tokens, which is quite comparable, right, to Llama, which is Facebook's, Meta's open source version of their a language model, which is trained on 1.25 trillion tokens. Okay, so what do I want to say? Well, I want to say that it's very important to look at not just the model size, but also look at the token it actually processed. So for example, in this particular nice slides compiled by our colleagues at AI2, you will see that different models, right, definitely have different ratios about how many tokens they've seen during the training time. So for example, GPT-3 has seen 400 billion parameters, 400 billion tokens, but then Llama has seen more tokens, right, with a smaller number of parameters. You can see this kind of ratio is very interesting, but also you see that over the years, right, in the last 20 years, the model went from 1.2 million parameters all the way, right, to 175 billion parameters. So that's huge in terms of the size of the model itself, but also the token it has seen before. Okay. Some of you are following the news this week. You probably know that Google also released Palm 2, which is their larger version and better version. Interestingly, CNBC leaked on the web that actually told people about the estimated parameter size that is smaller than Palm, but they actually train on 3.6 trillion tokens, right? And they attribute the significant improvement in large language model based on data quality. So data quality, in some sense, I think both researchers and users, we don't understand it very well, but turned out that if you read the GPT-2 paper carefully, it actually tells you that it carefully cleans the common core corpus that actually is the key, right, to the success of the GPT series models. Okay, so data quality is something that we haven't talked about very often, but is actually the key. Okay, so what do we know about GPT-4? There are a couple of things that is super interesting. One is that it has bigger context window, meaning that in the past, maybe you can just squeeze in like a short paragraph. Now you can squeeze in bigger documents. In the future, you can imagine maybe the whole document, right? Maybe a contract, right? So certainly the bigger window is the trend. The other thing that's unique about GPT-4 is text and image, right? So that you can deal with text and image at the same time. So from their exam results they evaluated on human tasks, certainly the performance is pretty impressive. But on the other hand, I do want to mention that even the GPT-4 technical paper admitted itself that they actually may have some train test contamination, meaning that in some sense, the academic data sets are no longer viable as a source to do evaluation because they're not entirely sure, whether their training data actually have used, right, your test data. So if there's a train test contamination in machine learning, this is really bad, right? This is like cheating. So, but that brings a bigger issue that is basically about the evaluation of large language model, that evaluating their capability, it becomes very difficult. But I think what's worse is the closed technology that in general public, we don't really know what training data they use. What I showed you just now was based on people's understanding about the technology. So we don't really know, right, what training data they use, especially for GPT-4. And we don't know about model weights. We don't have access to model weights. We don't know the detail about the model, whether there's any fundamental changes comparing to the earlier versions. And also we cannot access, right, this output probability. That is also a big challenge. At UCSB, we are committed to open science. We are a public school, so very proud that with many of our students, we're collaborating with industry to build open source technologies, including open source corpus and open source data, right, for this purpose. One of our students, Wang Yongzhu, has been working with AI2 and University of Washington, trying to replicate some of the training data for GPT-4, that you actually have text interleaved with images so that it may actually help you to enable some in-text learning capabilities. To do this, you can do it yourself in terms of the experiments. The other thing I want to briefly say a few words is that I often got questions from colleagues that tried ChatGPT to get some literature references. They realized that all of the references were bogus from ChatGPT. I think, if you want to try to get better result in terms of the fewer hallucinations, one alternative would be Bing plus ChatGPT, where Bing first gives you a retrieval, right, of the top documents, and then you're trying to generate that from that space, from the limited documents, then will reduce hallucination. So this is something that is good to know. So I tried this query, give me some papers about vision language navigation, and it gave me 3 papers that are pretty relevant, and they are not just bogus papers. These are real papers. Okay, so that's something you can look into. But I think a big part of today's discussion is about limitations, right? So I think we need to be very open about the strengths, but also we have to be very open about limitations. When should we avoid, right, ChatGPT? So one of the biggest issues is that ChatGPT doesn't really understand numbers, right? So that is something everybody should know. For example, we benchmark large language models on our, financial data, financial QA data set we developed with the technology management and also JP Morgan. Turned out that only get 60% accuracy in answering questions about finance, where you do need to aggregate a lot of different numbers and being able to come up, for example, the answer for very complex questions. So in those cases, it fails very miserably. And also for specialized domains like finance, legal, medicine, certainly is high-risk domains, they don't do very well. The other issue I'm also very concerned is misinformation, factuality, and hallucination. And as many of you have tried ChatGPT, it gives you confident-looking incorrect answers, right? This is one of the biggest issue, and there's no guarantee of the factual correctness. So how do we understand, right, the impact of this, LM-generated contents on the society? So this is something we have to deal with. And finally, there's also this bias, fairness, privacy, and copyright issues. How do we mitigate these issues? How do we help artists, right? And how would you be able to understand, privacy considerations? At UCSB, Professor Lady and Professor Yuxiang Wang and student Xuandong Zhao actually been actively looking at privacy approaches for training large language models, doing watermarking. So that, I think, is also very important of the discussion we should have. And this is just one of the example that in finance, certainly you shouldn't trust ChatGPT. Right now, the results are still pretty bad. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this. I don't think today we have expertise in econ, unfortunately, to talk about labor market. But there is this very interesting paper that is about survey for the American workforce about which job people think LLM will automate, and to just get people's opinion about this. So it turned out that 80% of the U.S. workforce, they would say that they could have 10% of the tasks, right, affected by the large language models, and 19% sees that at least 50% of their tasks are impacted, right, for good or for worse. Some people argue that it can help them to speed up their problem, but there are also people arguing that it will take away people's jobs. The most affected tasks are programming and the writing, the examples I gave you earlier. And there's also discussions about what kind of jobs that might be impacted, right, with the new technology. Okay, so going back to the students, right, going back to education, that's why we're here today. So what do students think about ChatGPT? In February, there's a very interesting article in New York Times that actually tell people, what the students think, right? So here's one example. I have the experience with ChatGPT before, and it's been really helpful for me when using it for personal questions, joke questions, or help on school assignments. It helps me gather research or understand the topic a lot better and faster. I also find it fun to experiment with, especially as a programmer. It's given me new ideas and ways to think about code. However, I do think it is important to fact check what it tells you, since it's not always accurate. And this is from a high school student. Okay, so high school students also know that it's important to do fact checking yourself to verify the answer. There's another one. People should look further into ChatGPT can actually do, because this AI bot can do something pretty cool. Some teachers can use this technology for making personal lesson plans for students so they can be more successful. And some teachers can use it for give highly detailed feedback on a student's work, right? So these are some interesting thoughts from our students in terms of what they think we can help them. However, in reality, you do see difficult news, right? This is the article that I read this week. It says that there's a professor in Texas. They flunks all of their students because they actually send student essays to ChatGPT and ask ChatGPT whether it has written the student's essay or not, right? Turned out that this is, of course, this is not reliable, and this is the actual student's email. So this person said, I have opened my own account for ChatGTP. you can see this is a good feature, right? If the professor writes you this way, the professor doesn't understand the technology, right? But you can see this is a very serious misuse of the technology that ended up resulting students' grade. This is something we should definitely avoid. But to do that, I think everybody needs to understand the technology a little bit better. Okay, but I'm very happy to share that at UCSB, we recently has the state-of-the-art in detecting LLM-generated content. So this is one of Linda Pezzo's students, and he did some really amazing work. It turned out he created this new technology called divergent n-gram analysis by prompting this language model multiple times to sample a distribution and then trying to match, right, the student's essays with this generate distribution from the large language model. Turned out you can be more accurate on various of data sets comparing to all of the baselines we've seen before. So I think there's still some improvements, but this itself, right, is interesting a research question for researchers and for the society in general. Okay, responsible in the AI research, I don't want to say too much about it, but I really appreciate David and also our university support for us to build a center in 2019 that we grow into a 60 faculty center with 20 departments involved. And we, like you see in today's events, is just one of the events, but we constantly have a lot of different events together. On our research side, we've been working on disinformation fact-checking since 2016-17, been looking at hate speech detections, understanding questions and answers in contradicting contexts, doing fact-checking, fake news detection on different modalities. My postdoc Liang Ming did a lot of interesting work recently to push the state-of-the-art in this area. Also, for fairness and attribution, our students, Sharon, Alex, and also with Michael, we did a lot of work in understanding dialects. We did work in understanding compound bias. We've been trying to understand memorization and generalization from these large language models. And also, I think AI safety is a real issue that we need to understand. How do we give a definition about safety? What are the 1% of the 1% edge cases that are high risk and high impact that we should avoid? So this is all open research problems. To conclude, before I open the panel, I really want to mention that a machine learning model is only as good as the data they've trained on. This is still true for large language model. The other thing is that certainly ChatGPT can give you plausible sounding answers. The open-ended questions answering are okay, but it still needs to be fact-checked. Bing plus ChatGPT give you retrieval. If the retrieval results are accurate, it turned out to be giving you slightly better results, more precise results. But what I want to mention is that it's critical to think about responsible and ethical considerations when we use that for research, for teaching, for learning, and other purposes. Okay. And finally, again, the last thing I want to mention is that next Friday, same time, 12 noon, we have a CRML special lecture. We invited Arvind Nilakanthan, OpenAI tech lead and manager, to UCSB to tell us about their recent work on retrieval augmented generation. So be in the same room. In Henley Hall, you'll be in person. It will not be live stream, as in contrast with today's event. Okay, so I spent a lot of time talking, and now it's time for our panel. I'd like to invite our distinguished panelists, Lei Li, Lisa Berry, Rita Relay, Nora Dunbar, and Joe Water to the front of the stage to join us with the panel. The way we're going to do with this panel is that we're going to start with a few prepared questions, and then just to get a warm start with the questions. And then what we'll do is that we'll also open the floor for the audience interactions towards the second half of the panel. So how about maybe we just do a quick introduction with our panelists, say a few words about yourself, what you're working on, and why are you interested in ChatGPT?
Hi, I'm Nora Dunbar. I'm a professor of communication. I study interpersonal communication and especially trust, credibility, and deception. How do you detect deception in humans? I'm also interested in how we establish trust when we are working with non-human conversational partners. So human-machine communication is an interest of mine as well.
Hi, my name is Rita Rayleigh. I'm in the English department, and I work in contemporary media and contemporary literature and culture. I've been writing about GPT-2, and I've been asking my students in English 10, the large undergraduate gen ed course, to write with GPT-3 last year, and this year with either whatever model, Stable LM or a chat application.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Joe Walther. I'm also a professor in the communication department. I'm currently director of the Center for Information Technology and Society. My primary research focus right now is on online hate speech and the social processes that develop it. But I'm interested in ChatGPT and similar models in terms of my educational activities and for the propagation and analysis of theory in society.
Thanks. My name is Lisa Berry. I'm the Senior Instructional Consultant in Instructional Development, which is part of the Office of Teaching and Learning. We support faculty and TAs across all of the disciplines and departments on campus. And so my primary interest really is how can we use ChatGPT and similar models to support students in their learning journey rather than to replace the learning.
I'm Lei from computer science. I'm working on natural language processing for more than 10 years, mainly working on developing translation model for a couple hundred languages. Right now, our target is 1,000 languages. We're not there yet. We have a model for 400 language now. So my interaction with ChatGPT actually was quite before even ChatGPT invented. 7 years ago, while I was at the previous company, I developed an automatic machine writing system. It's called Xiaoming Bot. At that time, 7 years ago, it's the real Olympics, so the system can automatically generate sports news for real Olympics. For 400 games there, many of them are, there's no reporter. So that's the first time we found this automatic writing technique is really helpful.
Great, thank you. I will start with Lei with a question just to have a start. Given your expertise in natural language processing, what do you perceive as the key strengths and weaknesses of ChatGPT, and how can these weaknesses be mitigated in future iterations of the technology?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, William mentioned all the strengths and the weakness already in the slides. I would like to highlight two of them. Two of the strengths I feel really important. Why this language model is different from previous generation of language model. So one is natural language instruction following. So this is quite different from previous machine learning models. The previous one, we always develop specific model for specific task. Now we can combine all these tasks and we can just tell with our own language, with text, to say, give me a summary of this article, okay? The model will give you the summary. Translate this from English to French, it will translate to French. So this instruction following is really useful. That means everybody, even if you don't know about machine learning, NLP, you can use a model, you can interact just like talking to another person. So this is really useful. The other is, William also mentioned this in context learning capability. What that means is if you really want the model to do something well on a particular task, maybe the model, this ChatGPT, it's not trained on the task. So usually in machine learning, we will need some training data to train the model for this specific task. But now we don't have to train this. We can just give a few examples, 5 to 10 examples, a couple, to the model. So then the model, it doesn't train, it learns on the fly, and then it's able to predict for the task. So I'm working with another collaborator on to identify news articles in Nepali language about wildlife conservation. And of course, we don't have any human label data for news article in the Nepal language, and we don't know Nepal language. We just ask a student to collect 10 examples and feed to the model. And the model can already get 70, 80% accuracy. That's incredible. So those are the two strengths. And the key weakness, I would say, so there are two key weaknesses. One is right now the ChatGPT and GPT-4, GPT-3, so it doesn't have awareness of error or confidence of the prediction. So it's very difficult to correct error. Often it might be even overconfident about its prediction, even if you tell the model your prediction is wrong, your statement is wrong, you should correct. Okay, next round it will still give the wrong answer. So how can we correct the mistakes by these models? It's unknown. It's a still challenging question. In the traditional way, we will further fine-tune the model, but now the model is so big we can't do that. The other weakness I would say is we are working on English and several major language. We found the ChatGPT is great and GPT-4 is also great, but for many other remaining language, it's not working that well. And we know that ChatGPT requires terabytes of data to train, and we don't have that much data for every language. Can we actually generalize this well so that this type of technology works well for every language? By every language, I mean maybe 200 languages, 200 major languages we use, without relying on much data. So that's still a huge challenge there. There might be some approach, but that's more technical. I will leave that to later discussion.
Thank you very much, Lei. And then I have a question for Lisa from the education and instruction point of view. How do you envision ChatGPT and similar AI tools being integrated into teaching and learning practices at UCSB? What potential advantages and challenges do you foresee?
Thanks. So to answer that question, I think it's useful to look at the big challenges facing UCSB and think about AI's role in tackling them. And to me, the 2030 UC goals really highlight two major challenges. First, we're going to need to educate 20% more students. And second, we need to close the approximate 10% gap in graduation rates between students who fall into particular systematically disadvantaged groups and those who don't. So students in these groups, which we've called effectors of opportunity here at UCSB, include underrepresented minorities, first-generation students, and students with extreme financial burdens. One reason that students in these three groups have systematically fewer opportunities to graduate is that they tend to have more responsibilities, which means less time to use our great campus resources like CLAS, the Campus Learning Assistance Services, and fewer opportunities to engage in peer learning communities. So part of closing this graduation gap is going to be to help these students use ChatGPT and similar models as personal learning coaches, which could range from asking it for feedback on their writing or code, to clarifying confusing topics, or even asking advice for how to approach a counselor. ChatGPT is actually really good at this type of dialogue. And I think the associated challenge here will be to teach students how to use the tool to support their learning rather than to replace their learning, to help the students interrogate the limitations of the tool. For example, knowing that their tutor may be biased or may hallucinate on occasion, and to safeguard their intellectual property. On the teaching side, instructors will likely be asked to teach those 20% more students with the same or fewer TAs. AI can help lighten this load in a variety of ways. So I've talked to professors who have used ChatGPT to generate the first draft of a syllabus or a lesson plan, to explain a difficult or threshold concept in very simple terms that their advanced understanding may make difficult. Or to generate ideas for more meaningful and perhaps ChatGPT-proof prompts and assignments. So faculty are, I also wanted to point out that faculty are already using AI very widely on our campus because it's integrated into the GradeScope platform, which professors are using to grade assignments more efficiently and equitably. And so on the instructor side, I think we're going to see very similar challenges to the student side, where we want to ensure that we aren't kind of sacrificing our creativity. And also, we really need to resist the urge to feed students' work into these models. To me, this is very risky violation of students' intellectual property. And though it's been suggested that instructors could save time by feeding student work into the tool to get personalized feedback for the students, they can instead let the students know that that's something they can do on their own if they choose to, but also kind of grappling with those realities of losing autonomy over how their ideas are used once they're fed into the tool. So I think that's kind of an overview of, the main ways that we can use these tools to support students' learning and to support instructors here on campus.
Thank you very much. And next, I would like to ask a question for Joe. And Joe, what do you perceive, right, as the key strengths and weaknesses of ChatGPT?
Can you tell me the second question too? Because for me, they go together.
Okay. The second question is, what role do you see the institutions like UCSB in shaping responsible and ethical use of AI tools like ChatGPT in society? So this would be a question related to the society.
Thank you, William.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, for being here today. ChatGPT has many strengths. William and others have talked about. It's certainly very easy to use. We all know this, although we haven't said it. And people like things that are easy to use, and students like things that are easy to use. When I look at ChatGPT, when I play with it and read about it, I fall into that. Answering the question, what content does it produce? What concerns might we have about students and other people trying to learn topics, content from it, especially in the classroom? And along those lines, I've come to a conclusion that ChatGPT is a garbage collector. And what I mean by that, and this relates very well, it's a more dramatic statement of what William pointed out to us, that any model like this is only as good as the data on which it was trained. But I think any agent like this is also only as good as the amount of information or the quality of information on which it can draw and that it can synthesize. And so I call it a garbage collector. But I ask you this question, and soon I think you'll see from my perspective. If I ask you how good would you consider the information on Wikipedia to be? And I think you'll answer sometimes very good, sometimes really, really bad. I mean, the crowd helps us see what consensus is, but sometimes consensus is false. How good? And so there's two other things I am. Is one, I'm a theorist, and second, I'm egotistical. You put that together, and I want to see what does ChatGPT say about the theories that I've published, and it's not very good. It's not a good rendition. And if a student turned in a paper describing this theory, and the paper was written by ChatGPT, it would not get a very good grade. It would not get a very good grade in the course where I had taught them about that theory. And here's why. You can see where some of the ideas come from if you've Googled enough and if you read enough. So if you ask ChatGPT to describe Walther's theory of X, you will see some things that came from some good journal articles, and you'll see some things that came from some bad journal articles, and you'll see some things that came from an okay textbook, and you'll see some things that were probably in a sophomore's PowerPoint presentation at Miami-Dade Community College on which they earned a C. And you will see something from somebody's blog post about what does Walther's theory mean to me. And all of this will be synthesized in a lovely 5-paragraph essay with an introduction, point number 1, point number 2, point number 3, and then a conclusion. And point number 3 will discuss the 3 elements of the theory when there's actually 4, and it got the second one wrong. So this is, but I think this is typical. I don't think this is an atypical example at all of how a large information gathering tool that uses the internet as its information source cannot help but be anything other than a garbage collector, because a lot of the information on the internet is garbage. There's brilliance, of course, but there's foolishness also, and there always has been. And so I don't know what we could expect a tool to do in terms of being discriminating. And that makes for promising assignments in the classroom, because I can ask the students to ask ChatGPT to tell them about the theory or an idea and so forth. And then I can say, grade it and correct it. And that's stimulating and fun. You know, I as somebody who's written something, and this is true for so many of us here, somebody who's written something and it belongs to the world, other people extend it, critique it, and so forth, and all of those things are very interesting. And any search tool, ChatGPT or otherwise, alerts us to things that people have said that we don't know, and we want to evaluate that. That's useful. And ChatGPT and other tools also can answer the question, name the most important criticisms of X. And so when it gathers that information and tells you what the most important criticisms are, it will tell you what, the oldest criticisms or the newest criticisms. Well, of course, it'll give the oldest criticisms. They're cited and repeated more often. And so the tool can't tell you what the latest thoughts were and the corrections were that have responded to the criticism. This isn't, I'm a social scientist, but I'm sure this is true for everybody. So that gets why I wanted the second part of the question. What can an institution like UCSB do for society and do for students? So I asked myself, what's an institution like UCSB? An institution like UCSB is where there are a lot of top researchers, a lot of people who have generated knowledge and who know their fields better than the garbage pail, better than the automated agent can do. And this is what we do every single day on our jobs, is to not only generate knowledge, but to confront the students with that knowledge and say, here's an insight that is different than the rest of the field say. Here is the gap that with a certain eye you can detect that needs improvement. And we do this better than the average person and even better than the average college teacher, because we are at a top research institution. So I think our opportunity is to help students see that these tools are very limited and are not the best way to learn something when you want to develop expertise or when you want to develop insight or develop higher order knowledge to be creative and to generate insights that are not already on paper. That's why they came here. Now, the students who major in communication, I've discovered, they don't take a single course in literature. At least they're not required to, and I haven't met any this quarter who have. If that means that they're not particularly interested in literature, they might be the kind of people that ChatGPT's description of Shakespeare might suffice. But if you want to know more about Shakespeare, take a class from our English professors. That's where you're going to see insights ChatGPT can't give you. That's why we're here. ChatGPT makes it really super clear that that's what a place like UCSB is for, and that's what we can do in society in relation to making sure our students know the difference between good enough and really important.
Thank you very much, Joe. I really like your bold statements. I think that really help us with a great panel. And the next, we will just move on to Rita. And Rita is professor of English. This question is, considering the potential of AI models like ChatGPT in producing human-like text, what implications do you see for the study and practice of literature and creative writing?
Okay, so the first thing to say is that a discipline that is foundationally concerned with expressive and instrumental uses of language might seem to be the most at risk and maybe the most on the sidelines. But in fact, I think it is quite the opposite. So the first thing to note about the training corpus, the book corpus that William mentioned, that was used for training GPT-1 is that it was made up of novels. And I think this is not an insignificant or a trivial point. But even besides that, I think that my discipline, which has developed a pretty elaborate apparatus for thinking about linguistic protocols, stylistic norms, and so forth, thinking about how we manage expression, in other words, grammar, syntax, dictionaries, thesauri, all of the, again, techniques and tools that we've used to manage language might initially, again, seem to be on the sidelines if we're thinking about not syntactical relationships, but rather value vectors. But I actually think it would be interesting to put into dialogue the new conversation or the new understanding about norms and, again, the sort of historical apparatus that we've developed. And I think we could go further and think about how, in some ways, maybe now is the moment to encourage thinking about expressive uses of language in our students. I mean, the whole employment category of prompt engineering, I think, is pointing us in this direction. But I think in some ways, maybe our students are more inspired to think about what they can do that would be different with language precisely now. So here would be the occasion to mention that I worry somewhat about the reductive understanding of originality and IP that is emerging. Turnitin.com, I think, led us in this direction, but even I would worry about n-gram analyses because it reduces the idea of intellectual property to character strings. And I think we can have a more extensive, elaborate, and maybe even nuanced understanding of what IP is really all about. Yeah.
Thank you. Next, we have Nora Dunbar, Professor of Communication. So the question for Nora is, how might the increasing use of AI models like ChatGPT in communication affects interpersonal dynamics and the way we perceive and understand information?
Thank you. I actually loved getting this question because I'm an interpersonal scholar, and I hadn't really been thinking about AI in the interpersonal realm at that point until William asked me this question. But then yesterday I was in a meeting with some scholars of computer-mediated communication, and I asked a question, and an expert said, you know, I was just discussing that yesterday with ChatGPT. And I went, wow. I kind of spaced out on the rest of what she said because I was so kind of surprised to hear her phrase it that way. I was discussing that with ChatGPT, and as if it was a conversational partner that you could dialogue about topics with. And I thought that was really interesting. It's actually not all that new. Several years ago, there was a former Google researcher named Seth Stevens-Davidowitz who wrote a book called Everybody Lies. And in his book, he says that's how people use Google, is they ask Google questions, and then Google responds with, you know, different links that you can click on in order to get the answer. And the reason why he calls his book Everybody Lies is because people ask Google things that they would never ask somebody like a real person, because you can ask it kind of your secret, you know, things that you're wondering about. And one of his examples is that he says that women search the question, is my husband gay, 10% more than is my husband cheating on me. So this is, you know, revealing what people are really thinking that they might not be willing to tell other people. And so the idea that you could have a dialogue with ChatGPT about things that you're wondering about that maybe are difficult to talk about with another person is very interesting, I think. A couple of years ago, Jeff Hancock from Stanford University and some colleagues wrote an article in the Journal of Computer Mediated Communication where they talked about AI mediated communication. And they defined it as interpersonal communication that is modified, augmented, or even generated by a computational agent to achieve communication goals. So you can use AI for a couple of different ways: as a conversational agent that you're actually discussing things with, or as a way to kind of augment your own interpersonal communication that you have with other people. So you can use this like ChatGPT to help you craft interpersonal messages. We saw this when someone at Vanderbilt University actually used ChatGPT to write a letter of condolence to Michigan State University after their school shooting. And people were outraged that you would use ChatGPT to write a condolence memo. Like, that's so, you're taking away the personal nature of it. But you can write all kinds of things, get ChatGPT to help you send interpersonal messages. But one of the things that's important in interpersonal communication is your ability to kind of synchronize or adapt or work with the person that you're having conversations with. So for example, if I email someone in a very formal way, they'll probably respond in a similar level of formality because we're used to kind of adapting. But if ChatGPT is writing our messages for us or augmenting our messages, then there might be sort of a lack of synchrony that we can't really coordinate our messages with one another in a way that we would naturally do if we were talking to a person. A lot of times in my research on deception, people know that something is off about a communication, but they don't put their finger on what it is. So you're reluctant to call someone a liar, but you just know something's different or wrong about that kind of communication. And so it might be the case that it affects our interpersonal communication with other people if it's mediating the way that we communicate with others, because it's not as authentic. It's not really coming from us, and you can't, ChatGPT doesn't know how to respond in the way that a human would.
Perfect. Now it's time to move on to the open floor. So what I'm going to do now is that I will put the mic stand here. So if you want to ask a question, you can form a line, just stay behind the mic, and then you can ask any questions with any panelists, or you can ask me questions as well. But please line up, and then we'll start with some questions. Great.
Great, thank you very much. This has been really fascinating. So I teach philosophy, I teach political philosophy, and I think all the concerns that you're raising and questions that you have are not really at all related to my main concern about ChatGPT. So I'm concerned that my students are, starting now in high school, not going to be interested in developing a thought for themselves that doesn't have words yet and translating it into words. What I mean by that is that I'm not necessarily interested in their expression as a way of building relationships or as a way of generally participating in communicative practices. I'm interested in the way they use language to think. And so I would like a response from you on that, because it seems to me that this is fundamentally different from all the other writing tools that new technology has brought into our mind. And I wanted to go back to what David Marshall said in the introductory remarks, which is that Plato was critical of the new technology of writing in his time. That's not quite precise. What Plato is criticizing is people who think writing itself contains knowledge. Only human beings contain knowledge, and writings are just a tool for the actual human activity of having thoughts, having ideas, and developing insights through language. So writing was always a tool for Plato, and what he thought was a problem is that we thought the tool was an end in itself, when really the end in itself is the human being having understanding, having thoughts, and developing their understanding and thoughts in exchange with other people using language. So are you seeing any discussions of this kind of worry that people might have who are teaching philosophy, especially teaching political philosophy. I teach students to think about democracy and justice and legitimacy. And so I really don't want them to just be generating ideas and then reacting to something else. I want them to be generating themselves.
So I think actually a starting point here would be to say that the epistemic shift, if it happened, wasn't with GPT or the chat application for GPT. Auto-compose, auto-predict, these are language models. They're predictive exercises as well. So I think the worry about students' exposure, let's say, to a different order or regime of language is to look in some ways in the rearview mirror. They have already been trained or entrained into this new regime. So then the question would be, well, how do we proceed from here? And I think here too, we have to begin from the recognition that a language model is not writing as you would understand it. It's a production of prediction. It's not writing per se. So the question is then, where do you go from there? Because in some ways, to try to bring to bear our historical understanding of what it means to cultivate thought in another human is absolutely an exercise that one should engage in, but I think to expect the audience or your interlocutor to have been trained in the same way as you or as us, I think that expectation is probably always going to leave us feeling frustrated. So how do we develop a pedagogy for a student or for a class of students that has been trained or, again, entrained into a different order of language, which is, again, not really language? That is the challenge. Yeah.
I'd love to chime in on this because this is something that I think about, how writing often is really about thinking and about getting those thoughts going. So I have a few different thoughts about how you can approach this. One is to kind of decouple writing from the thinking and to ask yourself, are there other ways to get students to think before they enter prompts into ChatGPT, for example, by having them generate a concept map or something like that. Another approach that a lot of instructors took on during the pandemic was flipping their class. So pre-recording parts of a class session, a lecture, so that students can watch them at home at their own leisure, at their own pace, speed, and then using the class time really for those thinking tasks. So if it is writing that students need to do, you can make that part of the in-class experience. There's also lots of other exciting new tools that are coming on the horizon, things like social annotation software, where if you want them to read a news piece about political theory or political philosophy, they can actually go in and start to annotate that document and then to build off of each other's ideas and thoughts. And so in this way, we're facilitating that interpersonal human communication that GPT, really doesn't do quite as well as humans do, in a really rich way that gets students attuned to using these different ways of thinking and communicating that they're going to need to use in our highly collaborative and digital world.
Thank you. I think it's a fascinating question and a terribly important challenge. In a way, it's a very, very old question. It's the same question we asked when we found we could offer students teaching by having them watch television, by listening to recordings. And so if writing is an epistemic process or human interaction in class or among people is an epistemic process, then we're confronted with some experts telling us, yes, but this large section of students, these are visual learners. And that writing is not best for them and so forth. And there's the old question of should the students learn from reading the Cliff Notes or reading the text and then talking about it. So I appreciate the dilemma. I think it's rather historical, and we'll keep seeing it pop up again and again. I had a technological solution. My professor offered me in my Shakespeare class when I was an undergraduate. Of course, she didn't want us to read the Cliff Notes. She said, go to the library. This is a long time ago when they had record players. And they said, get Gielgud reads Hamlet and put it on the record player while you read the script and turn it to 45 speed instead of 33 speed. This actually means something to some of you, 45 speed and 33 speed. But you'll get Gielgud's intonation. You'll understand what those funky words mean. By hearing a human speak it, you're still seeing the text. It was a great technological cheat, but it didn't take us away from the language.
All right, so I have 3 questions, and one question for the related, very related, for the panel, and the other 2 I hope to throw to David, but I don't see him here. But anyway, I'll throw the panel and also the audience. Well, I'm a professor of computer science, and I taught machine learning 10 years ago a couple of times, and I'm really fascinated by the ability to converse in ChatGPT. So since December, I've been thinking about using ChatGPT as my TA. So I did some exploration for 2 courses, and for a grad level course in mathematical logic, I think it failed. I would give it F or D at the best. And for data management course for the undergrad senior level, it did much better, but I think it probably around a B. As my question for hiring ChatGPT as a TA, I said no, too weak. So my first question is, the panel, especially Lei and William, how much confidence you have in large language models with a proper training data set to actually get something like that, a technology to serve as the TA, adequate TA. So that's that. I mean, just a gut feeling. Second question is, if we want to proceed to do that, now I actually feel optimistic with the proper training technology we can do that. But then so the consequent question is for education. Employing TA in courses is not easy, especially undergrad level education is heavily regulated by the standard rules. And what policies and so on we need to have to actually allow things like that to happen. Question number 3. Moving ahead, suppose we get to that point, I think we should have a group, working group or task force to actually explore this question of learning, well, with the proper data set learning, but more importantly, to actually develop a metric to say, this is good enough for serving as a TA, and maybe it's not enough, not good enough. So we need to have the ability to evaluate the technology to actually help us to make that decision. That's all.
Great. I'll try to, so thank you very much, gentlemen. I think all these are wonderful questions and comments. I'll try to do the easy one, which is the technical one. So language model itself, I don't think it can solve all of the problems. So one of the interesting research area in the AI community is called augmented language model. The idea is to teach language models to use tools to solve problems. So for example, one of our students actually found that if you combine this large language model, let's say ChatGPT, and you're teaching ChatGPT to use a logic program solver, right, prover, actually it can do relatively well for many of the reasoning problems you mentioned in teaching this, math courses that require logical reasoning. So, but that is just one example. But how do you teach, right, these language models to use different tools for different problems? Let's say book your next travel plan for you. How do you switch between different apps? How do you do the reasoning? How, it can actually help you, right, to leverage this expert tools, for example, Wolfram Alpha, to help you to derive, the gradient for some specific problem in one of your class. So I think we're still not there yet. Language itself is a very nice tool to help us access the knowledge, but there are still very specialized tools that is out there that actually do much better than ChatGPT itself. So that, I think, would be something that's quite interesting to look into in the future. I don't know if Lei has anything you want to add.
Yeah, sure. This is a very interesting question. Actually, one of my collaborators was asking whether we can use ChatGPT 40. We used that last quarter for one of the courses. So in one of the tasks, I set up the homework late policy. It's a complicated policy. We set up 72 hours as a total allowed, without any penalty for late homework. But we have 3 homework, so students can use it in any way they want. And we have to count each student on their individual homework, how much late hours they used. So it's a complicated task. We get that data, we just feed that data into ChatGPT. and count, and it's not even in a very nice that kind of table format. It's just in natural language, and we'll ask ChatGPT to summarize all the late hours for each individual student. And I trust the result. I just submit to our final grading, where I got 1 complaint from the student. So after I put the grades, and 1 student actually complained, you miscalculated my late days. And I go back, I checked. Oh, there is 1 error. There is 1 mistake. And all the rest are okay. Because I checked the first few, they are right. So I feel, okay, everything is just right for the remaining. I just take it for granted. But it turns out it's not the case. So this is for TA. But regarding to your question, so to what capability, to what level we can be sure, like using ChatGPT as TA. You are using ChatGPT as kind of its capability to answer your problems. But if we want to use ChatGPT as a TA, we should go beyond that. Because TA, we need to give explanation. We need to give hints or feedback to the students. So maybe not just like the how much accuracy we can get on the specific subject, but also can we use these models to give individual explanation on the errors of students? For that, we are not sure. We have some evidence, for example, for programming. One of our students collaborating with William found that this ChatGPT is pretty good for maybe our undergrad level program, those programs on program problems on LeetCode, for example. Those are similar to the interview problems at Google or Facebook. It turns out that this ChatGPT, I feel it's better, maybe better than the average capability of our own undergraduate student in computer science department. So I think the question for us is how we educate our students better. So at least we want them to be better than ChatGPT, right? Otherwise, okay, Google will just use ChatGPT to write their program.
Great. For the sake of time, maybe I will pass Jingwen's comment about policy to the academic senate later. Maybe Mark, you can go with your question. Yeah.
So this should be quick. So Lei and William, first, where do you think we'll be in, say, 3 years? You know, what the advance, how will things be different, better, worse from today? And if time, other folks in their discipline can jump in as well. But I'm talking about the evolution of ChatGPT and large language models and generative AI, and what it's going to mean and all that. So look forward a little bit.
Right. So I think it will allow us to access knowledge much more easier into different modalities. For example, we're looking at text with GPT-3. GPT-4, there's this definitely ability to understand PDF files, to understand images, but going to the future, if you look at internet traffic, a lot of them are videos, right? So how can actually systems understand videos, right? Understanding multimedia data. So I think this heterogeneous resources, structured data, unstructured data, will enable us a lot of opportunities to access, a vast amount of knowledge we don't have access to. So I think that would be a very interesting future direction of looking at this multimodal language models.
There are many directions we can go, and a lot of could happen. But one key issue I think would happen in the next few years is to make the model really small, compact, and efficient, so that it can even run on everyone's computer or everyone's cell phone eventually.
I'll just answer culturally and socially. I think just culturally and socially, I don't think GPT's next model is going to feel different. I think Whisper is going to feel different. I think truly having better speech-to-text models, that is going to produce a different kind of world.
Great.
Thank you. Predicting the future is always fun and never good. But already since ChatGPT became publicly available, other competitors and other forms with other limiters have come out, which I find very interesting. So one can use, perhaps it's Bing, I'm not sure, to say, answer me this question, but limit the information you survey to that which you can find in Google Scholar, which would suggest that's a real heads up. Now, Google Scholar is its own garbage pile, but a better garbage pile. So back to the question I was asked, what's the role of a institution like ours? We take on the role of helping students ask questions better of technology. For a long time, it was such an advantage to know how to do a Boolean search, which was something not everybody knew, but we would teach people to do, to be able to use the library effectively. So the more we know about how to do searches more effectively with the right limitations, the more we can train our students, but we still must train them to be very shrewd and careful consumers of what they get. So this is certainly advancing already. 3 years from now, I couldn't even tell you.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to make one maybe counterpoint and a follow-up question. One counterpoint is in terms of, I think underestimating what the technology can do, especially computing, is common. So I think in tasks that we have seen that people throw as, well, this is never going to be achieved. I think chess was in the 90s. And then we had, that was a big accomplishment, people thought, And then I think there was the challenge of winning the, with Tom Watson, IBM, Jeopardy winning. And I think in terms of explainability, actually, of a theory, I wouldn't bet against ChatGPT. I think explaining things that are already written or specified, I feel that, throwing more memory, because there's unlimited memory that they are throwing at it. As the parameters are increasing, as humans, we don't have unlimited memory. It's just in the brain. So there is this, again, growth I think is likely to happen. But my question is, this emergent behaviors we are seeing, which is really surprising, that although you are learning from just code and written text, that you see some emergent capabilities that it doesn't train for. And this, to me, brings this very interesting research question. How do you characterize those emergent behaviors? And as a human, I'm hoping creativity is, for example, something that coming up with the theory is something maybe it wouldn't do, right? So, but there is this interesting question of what is the thing that we think these tools are not going to have, these emergent behaviors are not going to express. So any insights on that? What do you think? Is this an area that this, although it's natural language processing is very specific, but now that with emergent capabilities, is that being investigated?
That is an excellent question. So at UCSB, we have this Melon-Chen Mind and Machine Intelligence initiative that Professor Miguel Eckstein from psychology and I were looking at. One particular topic that we've been looking into is human versus machine in terms of expertise. For example, right now, I think the boundary becomes a little bit unclear that what tasks that humans are good at, what tasks that machines are good at. So it becomes very difficult. For example, in recognizing objects, right? Miguel had some studies in the past to really understand human cognition, right? How we understand objects, how we foveate to a specific person, and how our visual systems, right, actually help us to recognize objects. How is that different from machine, right? If you run just a recurrent neural network, mask RCNN, this kind of object recognizer, what kind of objects it missed, right? What kind of object it was able to find. So I think to study the task, right, itself is very interesting, that there are thousands of tasks that is out there, how many tasks that humans can actually win, how many tasks that machines are really good at. Itself, I think, is a very interesting technical direction, but I think Lei can say a few words.
Yeah, I think when we compare human to model, human brain roughly has 80 billion neurons, and now ChatGPT 175 billion parameters. So it's about the same size. Of course, the human is more energy efficient, but essentially this model so mathematically, it's a good model of conditional density estimator. So why it's so you are talking about the emerging capability. I think the reason why it has this emerging capability, it's because now this transformer-based language model, it turns out it's a very good density estimator comparing to all the traditional models, and it can fill in the gap. So those gap, even if you don't have data on those tasks, it can fill in the gap because it's a good density estimator. Well, is there any task that this cannot do? There are certainly knowledge. So if we believe all the knowledge that can be represented in written text, those knowledge can be modeled by some proper mathematical probability distribution, then we should have the strong belief that we can build a model to learn such distribution from the data. But there can be some human knowledge that cannot be written, or that cannot be represented formally, or even if it can be represented, it cannot be efficiently computed. So then those type of knowledge or those type of task may be not easy to be computed by this type of model.
And I'd just like to add to that, kind of bringing it back to the question about, can I hire ChatGPT as my TA, to think about, what really does differentiate an actual human graduate student TA or myself from ChatGPT. And there's a lot of things that humans can do that ChatGPT will never be able to do. The primary one is to motivate people, right? To create real live experiences that we can adapt real time depending on the facial expressions of people in the room, depending on how it's going, we can pivot. And I will admit that for this talk, the first thing I did was take the prompt that was given to me and feed it into ChatGPT. I was very curious what it would produce. It was pretty bland. It was not very exciting, and it really wasn't contextualized at all in terms of UCSB and the challenges that we face here. And so I think those are, just other things that the machine can't do as well as humans. But yeah, let's not forget that we're humans. We aren't just fact regurgitators or knowledge synthesizers. Above all, we can create social learning experiences that the computer just will never do.
I would disagree with that. we have GPT-4, William just mentioned. GPT-4 has a capability to read from image, not from video yet, but I think it will soon be there. So checking the emotional expression from the image, I think it's doable. It's not there yet, but it's doable within 1 or 2 years.
Sorry, I would just say in general, it's the problem or the difficulty or challenge with technological critique. It's that if one stops at pointing out the limitations or the capacity for error, that problem gets dissolved or resolved fairly shortly, especially with NLP. But with respect to the TA, I mean, therapeutic uses of conversational AI have just exploded, and there's empirical research that indicates that it's effective, which means the experience of it is effective. So again, I think one can point out limitations, but be aware that these limitations get resolved. Yeah.
John Gratch at USC has done some really interesting work with members of the military talking with avatars about PTSD, and they're often much more willing to be open and discuss their problems with a non-human conversational partner because they don't feel like the conversational partner is going to judge them the way a human therapist does, which I found really interesting, but they're proving to be very effective already, and that's baby technology compared to what we have even now.
It goes back, it's the ELIZA effect, right? Yeah.
So I think it's not unreasonable to state that there's some probability that these systems will be superhuman in 5 or 10 years, right? So if they're able to resolve all of these limitations that we mentioned today, and are able to capture something that of this non-representable thing that we're talking about, then my question to you all is, would you be encouraged or worried about this?
So I think the definition of a superhuman is usually not very well defined. I would certainly think that there are a lot of news articles we're reading about, okay, there's this company got superhuman performance on this task, but turned out what happens that they just evaluate that on a specific data set. And because of the data set contamination issue I mentioned, now it becomes really difficult to access the capabilities of large language models, also compare that with human. So I think there are certain tasks that certainly you have to talk about specific tasks, but defining like superhuman in general is very difficult. It's not very well defined. So that's my perspective.
We heard about the superhuman for machine translation like 5 years ago. They have study and they have headlines, but machine translation is not solved yet. But also superhuman, do you mean super like better than average human, like amateur human, or average human, or expert human?
Better than the best possible human.
Yeah, expert human. I feel well. Machine can run faster than human, so you can calculate more precisely than human, can calculate bigger numbers than humans. That's already there, but we don't call it intelligence. So once it can do something, maybe some of the work won't be counted as intelligent anymore.
I don't know the answer. I think it's a fascinating question, and it would not surprise me if we see unexpectedly human-like activities and capabilities develop. This reminds us of the last question before you: is do we expect to see activities that look like human, that are self-contained and automatic and so forth? And I don't know, and but I guess you have to decide what you mean by superhuman. We've already seen kind of low-level, cool, creative activity. So what was it the other day? What would it look like if Jesus was in a cave taking a selfie? Did you see that in the newspaper? It was something like that. And if you haven't seen it, you can imagine you could easily see it, and AI could render that for you. Is that the ability to generate something that is not real, yet combine those things? Is that a demonstration of hypothetical thinking? Perhaps it is, and perhaps that means we're not far away. If you can hypothesize the combination of those three visual elements with some kind of, that each have their own kind of sentiment and meaning, maybe we're closer than many of us might think.
Yeah, I think like my question is more, if you assume that this is already where we are, then what do we do as humans, right? That's what I was trying to get at.
I don't know. I'm sure you know better than I.
Okay, for the sake of time, maybe we should do the last question.
All right. First of all, thank you all for being here and answering my question and concern. I just want to bring up a bottleneck that I observe in the NLP area for quite a while. Large language model needs to be trained, and training requires some pretty good hardware, some pretty good GPU. As a college, as a university, we don't have much resources than those big companies in the industry have. We, students, we don't have 8 A100. We only have 1 4090 for fine-tuning Llama as a backbone of a conversational avatar. So my question is, do you think this is a bottleneck from the hardware perspective in NLP research area? And my second question would be, for us, without access to this freaking awesome GPU, those accelerators, how do we achieve good results in a comparably short amount of time in NLP research projects?
That is an excellent question. I'll just say a few words. So this is definitely a concern. So we acknowledge this concern. it is happening. There's a big divergence in terms of the resources in the industry and in academia. So for OpenAI, from public information, that they use tens of thousands of GPU that Microsoft specifically built for them to do pre-training. So I don't think any universities in the world can do any pre-training research anymore. But there's still, like you said, fine-tuning, right, on one specific GPU. There's some research that actually start looking at lower precision. Instead of looking at 32 bits, very high precision numbers, you can look at 4-bit, you can look at 8-bit to actually allow fine-tuning of bigger models on a single GPU. So that is an active research. And I see Mark Abel here that at IEE that we're standing right now, we also have this interest in looking at green AI, that how can we improve the capability of the model to make them smaller, but also make them more effective and more efficient. So this itself, I think, is good research. Going back to your questions about resource different, I think nationally that there is this discussion in the Congress about a national AI resource, specifically for the universities, for the governments, and for people who don't have access to those clusters. So this is indeed a concern, and hopefully with more open source models that we actually get to use better models, but actually smaller, can compete, right, with the capability of some of these bigger models.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, we have many students share the same concern as you. So people really feel NLP is done, or there's nothing we can do at the university on NLP or even machine learning. Well, I would say on the high level at university, we are not competing with companies. ChatGPT, you can view, so it's like Google. ChatGPT is a product. It's not a kind of research type of work. Of course, behind that, there's research that's called Instructor GPT if you read that paper. So we can develop technology along that line, but we don't directly compare with product. For the same reason, like if we do, say, web search at university, we don't compare with Google. We do principled research that can generalize well to many tasks, and if they are applied in industrial scenario, they can be like deployed at a much larger scale, so it will be a real product. But at university, we study the principle, we study the theory, we study the method and technology that can generalize across different tasks. I think along this line, there are a lot to be done for machine learning, for NLP, and many other aspects of AI.
Gotcha. Thank you.
If I may, of course, all of these things are true. Of course, people such as yourself should have access to all the learning materials that are possible in this exciting, new, dynamic, and promising area. People especially like yourself who have a sweatshirt that says UCSB and who are in proximity to the director of the Center for Responsible Machine Learning. You can be trusted, and you should have all these tools. But of course, be careful what you wish for, because the arms race that David Marshall referred to has been attributed to the competition between Google, who has become wealthy as a search tool, and Bing, that's always been behind, and so the arms race in ChatGPT-like applications is an arms race for control of the commercial benefits of search engines, and so I do not expect it will be long before, when you ask ChatGPT for help with programming, it recommends that you try a different routine and have a cup of Starbucks espresso, because these two things have, unfortunately, advertisement and search, free search, have a long history together. So I want you to have these tools, but I think we need to be careful what we wish for. What's going to happen when everyone gets them? To what purposes are they curious, and where will be the application? The dark side is very close right behind us.
It's very enough.
Great.
Thank you so much.
So as we are running out of time, I would like the panelists to maybe just use one sentence to summarize your parting thoughts. Two is okay, but before we conclude, any parting thoughts?
I will be using ChatGPT to write better jokes now that you have taught me how. I think I've spoken enough. Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to be here today.
Well, it's a point that you and the EVC made at the outset, but my advocacy argument for my colleagues in HFA is simply we need better technological literacy. So if I had my druthers, I would reform our A2, the writing requirement, to actually make NLP a fundamental part of it.
I would just add that from the world of misinformation, that trust is fragile, that when we breach the trust of the general public, they're reluctant to come back, right? So after Watergate, voting dropped precipitously. If people cannot trust what they see, if AI is generating fake images and people can't trust the news, people can't trust what they're seeing, we're going to lose them. And it's a real danger for our democracy and our society to have untrustworthy information.
So I think in terms of classroom teaching, my parting thought is that we really need to consider what tasks we can safely outsource to AI. And these tend to be the low order cognitive tasks like knowing and explaining, and what really require a human element, like contextualizing, evaluating, generating new ideas, and most importantly, cultivating human connections.
So I think we need to have more events like this to have a better public knowledge about these latest NLP models, to raise the awareness of in particular, the weakness of these models. I feel right now, because of all these news headlines, people really have hype. Have much higher expectation than the actual capability. So that might be dangerous.
Great, thank you, Lei. And that brings me to this reminder that next Friday, we invite you to be in person, 12 noon in the same room to discuss with our OpenAI guests. With all that, I want to thank all of the audience. I want to thank again all of the panelists for this wonderful discussion opportunity. Thank you.